In this video you will learn how to create a wet flow effect. For this we will first develop a fully procedural workflow, then blend in surface details for a more photorealistic look, and finally use Vertex Painting to position our puddles exactly where we want. So in this video here we're going to be building some nice procedural puddles, as you can see in here, which follow our surface. So you can see they kind of follow here these stone plates, and additionally they are fully procedural, so you can change here the width, for example, of the puddles, or you can also change here the positioning of them. And as you can see, always everything updates here accordingly and looks and feels quite realistic. So we're gonna check out how to build this in this tutorial. And as usual, you can always find all of my scene files on my Patreon together with a whole course on car rendering. So check out this if that's interesting for you. But now let's just jump in and see how this effect here is done. So here we can see our finished effect, and the whole effect consists out of 3 different shaders which are blended together. And we have this kind of like dry part here of our pavement, which you can see in those parts. Let me just pre-visualize this. So you can see all these parts which are red, basically they are the dry pavement. And then we have here our wet pavement. So let me just show you where this is located. So all of those parts which are green now, this is our wet pavement. And then we also have our water. So that are these kind of bigger puddles of water. And those are positioned in those parts in here. And as you can see, they kind of follow here the surface of our pavement. So we get these kind of interesting accumulation of water here in these kind of like creases and crevices. And that's what we're going to be building now in this kind of tutorial in here. So now we can easily just apply those different shaders to just see how they look like. So this one here is basically our normal asphalt. You can see there's no wetness effects in there. And then we have our wet asphalt. So this one is basically a darkened down version of the dry asphalt. And we also increased here the reflectivity. So you can see there's like this kind of like blurry reflections here of those objects. And then lastly, we have this kind of like water puddles. So this one basically has full reflection with a little bit of bump here to get this kind of like wavy effect. And those are basically the 3 kind of shaders that we're going to be using. And as you can see in here, they're set up quite easily. So I just have a color map, I have a normal map, and I have a roughness map in order to build these 3 different shaders. And then I also have a displacement map here for the pavement, which we're going to be using later on in order to blend the puddles here nicer with our pavement. So now we have to smartly blend those 3 different shaders here together. And for this, what I like to do is to give each of them here a very strong diffuse color. You can see this one has a red, this one has a green, and this one has a blue diffuse color, so that I can go in and disable here the diffuse map, and then this color here is picked up. And this can be quite helpful to know exactly where you're positioning those shaders. So for example here, if we apply our wetness effect, then let's just temporarily disable here the diffuse map so that the shader becomes completely green. And then we can much easier see where we're positioning this shader. So now we can take the base part of our shader and just put this into a V-Ray blend material and put this here as the base material. Then also apply this shader to our geometry. And now we can also add here the first part. And now we can easily add this wetness effect on our code 1. Once we do this, you can see we get this kind of like half transparent effect, because at the moment we use this color here to blend it. And let's put this all the way to black so that we're not using this color value here to blend, but we will build our own mask in order to blend this kind of shader here on top of our pavement. So now in order to build our procedural mask, let's first add different kind of nodes in here. One would be a noise. Then we would also add a composite, and let's also add a simple output map in here. So now once we have those set up, let's just put here the noise in our layer 1 of our composite, then connect this composite in the output map in here. And then let's also put this into the blend 1 of our shader. So that would be here the mask for our wetness effects. So now we can see a lot of green is introduced, and there's a very subtle effect where some of those green parts here are slightly more opaque than others, but it's very difficult to see that, and that's where this kind of output map here comes into place. We can enable this color map, and then we can add 2 more points in here. And let's, for example, give this here a value of 0 and this one here a value of 1. And now you can start to see an increased contrast. And if you move those different points here closer together, you can see a stronger separation of those parts in here. Let's now put these 2 values here very, very close together, because the wetness effect is kind of binary. So it's either there is some wetness or it's already completely dry. We don't really have this very smooth transitions. So I think something like this here is good for a start. So now we can go to our noise, and then let's also in here play with these values. Let's, for example, choose fractal noise. Let's give it a size here of 60. And I think that's basically good for now. So now we have some kind of puddles here masked out, or rather the wetness effect. And at the moment it doesn't really look very realistic, because we just have these kind of like masks here which don't really seem to follow at all our surface, and that kind of makes it look very, very CG, not very realistic. So we have to find some way to try to address that. So this is now where our displacement map here comes into play. And while the noise that we created down here is responsible for basically the rough outline here of our puddles, the rough placement, we can use this displacement map in order to make some fine breakups here so that it looks much more fitting to the surface itself. And for that, as said, we're going to be using here our displacement map. So I can easily go inside here and add a new layer. And then let's put here our displacement map into a simple color correction. Let's switch this one here to advanced. And then let's connect this color correction here into our second layer of the composite. And then we have to also switch this mode here to overlay. So now you can see we have a kind of very different effect here, where we're kind of breaking up here the borders of our wetness effect. But at the moment, it kind of shrinks the whole effect quite drastically. So you can see there's a huge difference on if I use this one here or not. So this one is if I not use it, and if I enable this again, it kind of shrinks here our puddles quite drastically. So this we can counterbalance here, for example, with this color correction map that we built earlier. Let's put here a value of, let's say, 225. And then once I disable this, you can see there's almost no change. But what you can see is that it kind of breaks up here these kind of edges here in a very nice way. And we kind of like respecting here these gaps in between those stones and so on. The issue that we have at the moment is that this effect is kind of inverted. So you would rather expect that the water here accumulates more in these kind of gaps in here rather than on the flat surfaces of the stones. And for this, we have to basically here invert our displacement map. So let's do that. Let's invert that. And once we do this, you can see that for some reason it becomes completely bright. In order to counterbalance this, you can put here the RGB offset to 0.5. And now we kind of get a similar brightness back to what we had before. And now it's just a matter of dialing in here the correct value. So for my testing, I already found this one here is 175. And then once I hide or show this map, you can see there's almost no change in the overall shape here of the puddles. But you can see now we have this effect that the water here accumulates rather in those gaps than on the stones. And it's much longer visible here in these kind of like lower areas. So now if we want to, we can go in our shader and enable the diffuse map again. You can see that now we have this kind of like nice parts where we have this kind of wetness effect here happening. And now the only thing we still have to do is to add these kind of puddles here in the center of them. So for this, let's add here in our blend material our water shader. And then let's also make this one here to complete black so that we use whatever map we put in here. And let's also put here the diffuse color at the moment to this kind of bluish value in here so that we can better see where we're placing this shader. So now the procedure is actually very simple. We can just easily take here our output map that we built earlier and then also put this into our blend map in here. And once you do this, you can see you have now exactly the same position here that we have for this wetness effect. But we can now just easily take these two different dots and move them around. So if we make it to the left side, it will grow bigger. If we rather move it to the right side, you will see that this effect here becomes smaller, and we're basically placing these kind of like puddles here in the center of our wetness effect. So it looks like there's some deeper water in here, and then we kind of have some kind of remaining water here on the edges, which is slowly drying out, and then we have here our completely dry pavement. So now we can just go in and put our diffuse map here back, and then we kind of get here our final result where we basically have these kind of like puddles here in the center, this kind of wetness effect here on the sides. And overall, I think it looks quite nice like this. So now if you wanted to, you could add a simple color correction here in between. And this would basically enable you to change the look of your puddles. Let's just do that. Let's just add here a simple color correction. Then let's connect these two different maps in here. And then once we switch this one here to advanced and we play with the gamma, you can see we can grow or shrink this kind of effect. If we decrease the gamma, for example. And like this, you can easily define of how much water you really want to have in here, how much of the wetness effect, and so on. Now for the final step, let's increase this here to, let's say, a gamma of 1.25 so that we have really a lot of puddles in here. And now I want to talk about a way that we can procedurally place also these puddles so that they don't really appear everywhere, but we can kind of define exactly where we want those puddles here to show up. So for the next step, I had to kind of reorganize here this view a little bit so that we have access to a few more options. And this shading network here is exactly where we left off basically. You can see now we have a lot of those puddles here everywhere. And I want to now find some way to kind of like more manually place them. And for that, we can use Vertex Painting. So let's select here our floor object. And you can see this has a bunch of vertices here basically, and we can add here a simple Vertex Paint. And then you have to disable here the texture and then switch this one here to this mode. And now you can basically draw here with the brush, you can draw some areas out where you want your puddles to appear. At the moment, this doesn't really has any effect yet because we first need to incorporate that into our shading network down here, but let's do that in the next step. So let's move this here off to the side, and then inside here, this composite, the one that we created in the very beginning, where we just have our noise, and then we blend our displacement map. Let's add here a new map, and let's put this here in between the noise and the displacement map. And then inside here we can use this vertex color mode. And at the moment it doesn't really look exactly how I imagined, because that's basically just set here to normal blend mode, and our noise here doesn't have any effect. So let's change that. Let's switch this one here to multiply mode, and now basically we can add these puddles, and they are basically added here or removed from our base noise. So we can easily just basically draw in, and some random puddles will appear in those parts in here. You can also play here with the blending mode and basically just make this slightly less, and you get some kind of fading effect where we have some smaller puddles here on the sides. And if you go to a much higher value, then only the puddles will appear in exactly those parts which we painted in here before. So that concludes this tutorial. As usual, I hope you liked it. And as always, you can find all of my scene files on my Patreon if you want to test it on exactly the same scene. And as said, there's also a whole course on card rendering that you can check out with some other additional goodies. So head on over there if that's interesting for you. Otherwise, see you in the next tutorial. Take care and see you soon.